guys, welcome to Wednesday Devotional. This week we begin our study on the book of Ephesians. So every Wednesday for the next 6 weeks, we will be uploading a devotional on each of the chapters on the book of Ephesians. All right, let's get started. So the book of Ephesians was written by Paul, and it can be split into 3 different parts. The first one is the introduction. The second one is the doxology, also known as praise. And the third one is thanksgiving and prayer. So in the introduction, Paul pretty much just introduces himself and his audience. In the doxology, one of the things that stands out to most scholars is the authenticity of Paul. So during this time, there was no Christian group, but one of the things that Paul is doing in this letter is that he's beginning to create a Christian culture. And the way that he does that is by talking about his story. He begins to talk about the words and the things and the attributes of Christ that have impacted him the most. He talks about grace, he talks about hope, he talks about faith, he talks about forgiveness, and he talks about love, all in the doxology. One of the things that Paul does in this worship is that he talks about something that everyone can relate to. Even though our stories are different, there is something we can all relate to, and that's found in verse 7. It says, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sin, in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavishes on us." So Paul pretty much is saying that even though we all have different journeys, even though we've all been saved from different things, the one thing we can all relate to is that we have all been saved by the sacrifice and the love and the blood of Jesus Christ. This is one thing that brings us together as a group. This is one thing that brings us together as a community. One of the things that Paul is asking his audience to do is to be authentic with their story and their journey with Christ. Not to follow somebody else's, not to copy somebody else's story, but to be real with who they are, where they've been saved from, and where they have been brought to at this point. Then he follows by giving thanks and prayer for the community, the thing that brings us together. And he compares the power of community of a Christian group to the power that raised Jesus Christ from the dead. It's actually pretty incredible. It says in verse 18, "I pray that the eyes of your hearts may be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people, and his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at the right hand in the heavenly realms." A lot of scholars like to point out how the power that he's talking about is the power of bringing people together. The power of bringing people together is the biggest and the greatest testimony that we can ever have about who Jesus is and our salvation story. Today I want to challenge you to do 2 things. Number 1 is to reflect on the journey that you have had with God. Think about where God has brought you from. Think about the attributes that stand out the most in this journey that you have had with God, whether it's forgiveness, whether it's grace, whether it's generosity, whether it's opportunity. Just think about the things that stand out the most, and let's live the way Paul has called us to live, authentic lives, reciprocating this grace, reciprocating this generosity, this opportunity, giving back to the community what God has given us. The second thing is I want to challenge you to think about how you can influence the Christian community today. Because it is only through this Christian community that we can fully comprehend and begin to understand the riches that God has prepared for you and me. Thank you guys for joining us for this week's study on the book of Ephesians. Join us next week as we study chapter 2.